much. So I'm going to be talking about the spiritual history of vegetarianism and veganism, and until very recently, it was a spiritual and religious movement. It came packaged within religious teachings. The secular vegetarian movement is actually fairly new. And so pardon me for sitting, but in order to do the PowerPoint and all, I need to do that. Lisa mentioned Main Street Vegan Academy. This is a program that I do. It's a professional training program so that people go out and become coaches. Many of them start vegan businesses. I do this, I call it a cultural history of vegetarianism. And it's 2 different classes, and it's an hour and a half each. So if anybody is really interested in this topic, see me after. I can give you my email. And I would be honored to have you join that class as a guest, just so that as I rush through this in 25 minutes, it reminds me of that book, A Brief History of Time. This is a brief history of spiritual vegetarianism, and it's going to be quite a ride. So I'm going to start in the beginning, a very good place to start, because in the Western traditions, in the biblical traditions, in the book of Genesis, Eden was vegan. We were given plant foods to eat. I call it the Hawaiian vacation diet. It was fruits and nuts. After the fall, we get the leafy greens and some other things to eat, and then there's the flood and everything gets different. But the ideal in these teachings, Yahweh's ideal for humans, really, and for all beings, was that we weren't supposed to kill and eat. That's why they called it the Garden of Paradise. And the quotation here is from Isaiah's beautiful prophecy about the earth that is to be. So, this is the original diet for humans, and I actually know some raw fooders and people in Hawaii and Costa Rica that pretty much eat like this now. So this is the first controlled nutritional experiment, and that was when Daniel and his friends were captured by an enemy king, and they didn't want the king's fancy foods. And so after a period of time on the lentils and vegetables and water, they were stronger than the king's soldiers. So nowadays, a lot of evangelical churches do a Daniel fast. So it's usually 21 days. And even though it was 10 days in the story here, but 21 days, people in these churches will eat as a vegan. And they also, it's real clean. They also don't drink coffee and stuff like that for the 21 days. And then they all feel so good, but then they go back to normal. So here's our job. We got to change normal. So moving on into the New Testament, we see here Jesus is being baptized by John the Baptist. So John and Jesus were cousins. Their mothers were sisters. Now we don't know if John's mother married into the Essene community, or if she and Mary were raised as Essenes. The Essenes were one sect within Judaism. There were many, in particularly the rural areas, that were not the mainstream Jews, more in Jerusalem and more attached to the temple. And they had different sorts of beliefs. Essenes were pacifists, and they were communal, and they were vegetarian. So here's the question. If in a very close-knit community where families know one another, if your cousin was vegetarian, wouldn't you know that? So Jesus, obviously, whether or not he himself was vegetarian or grew up vegetarian, he knew about vegetarians. And when I say vegetarian, at this time, it was probably what we would now call vegan, because they wouldn't be raising animals just for so-called byproducts. Now, John's an interesting case. He obviously wasn't an ethical vegan that we would talk about today, if indeed he wore a leather girdle, but his food, when it says locusts, the beans of the locust pod. Who's had carob? Some people say it's as good as chocolate. People who like chocolate say not quite. But it's a sweet, pretty good tasting substance, and that was what it was meant here by locust. He wasn't eating insects. And then, of course, the wild honey, he wasn't vegan in that way, although in the early days of veganism it was said that honey was to be left to personal conscience. Now, what is interesting in this Jesus story is, yes, we know he was hanging out with fishermen. There is no indication in the Bible that he was vegetarian, although until the story after the resurrection, when he is said to eat a piece of fish, the only thing we're ever told in the Bible that he eats is bread and wine. So we don't really know about that. But what we do know, there are a couple of interesting stories. So we've got the miracle of the loaves and the fishes. When there's a wedding at Cana, they don't have enough food for everybody, and Jesus multiplies the food. Now, when Professor Ryn Berry, who was a teacher at the New School in New York City, and called the vegetarian historian, in fact, there's a movement to make his birthday, January 31st, Vegetarian History Day. And when he taught the first time at Main Street Vegan Academy, and people at the end asked about how do you talk to Christians, what about the loaves and the fishes, he was a very humble guy. He had his notes on a legal pad, and he kind of looked down, kind of like, I don't want to brag, but he said, when I translated the New Testament from the Greek, when I translated the New Testament from the Greek, I realized the word for fish in the New Testament everywhere is the word for fish. But in that story, it's a different word. It's a word that has as its first definition a relish or a spread that you might serve with loaves. Second definition, dessert. Third definition, little fishes. So my contention is that some translator believed that it was more miraculous to multiply fishes than to multiply hummus. So I now think of that as the story of the loaves and tahini. But whatever Jesus may have said that we don't have in the four Gospels, or whatever he may have practiced at that time in his own life, what we do know is that vegetarianism was rampant in the early church. And St. Paul was just not happy about this. He thought that there were much more important issues to deal with. He was not interested in being vegetarian himself. But in the early church, and for about the first 300 years, and some of these names, of course, are people later than that, we're not sure about St. Francis of Assisi. But these other people wrote about it, spoke about it, and I highly recommend the book Vegetarian Christian Saints. The author, fascinating woman, she's a medical doctor, she is a Jewish Buddhist who wrote this incredible book about early Christian saints. So why did they do this? Well, there's an interesting woman that you may have seen on the Today Show. She's a business expert. She is the widow of the illustrious CEO of GE for many years, the late Jack Welch. She is Susie Welch. She is a vegan, and she's an evangelical Christian. And the way she explains it is that in her own life, her love for Jesus is so profound that she has to be vegan because she has to extend that love to everybody. And I believe that if he was indeed what Christians believe and what a lot of people who admire people outside their faith believe, if he brought this kind of loving energy to this planet, that extended beyond his death, causing people like Susie Welch to want to be as kind and loving as they could be. So we're going to move beyond the Bible now and come over to Greece and actually Italy, where this gentleman spent most of his life and did most of his teachings, although he was Greek. And this is Pythagoras. We know him from the formula, the theorem, but he was a Renaissance guy. So in addition to being a mathematician, he was a philosopher. He was also an athletic trainer. The statue there on the left is one of his athletic accolades, and that was Milo of Croton. And Milo was a war hero. He was a wrestler who took the gold in several Olympics. But Pythagoras would not let you train with him as an athlete or study philosophy and mathematics unless you agreed to first a 40-day water fast, and then that you would go on what we would today call a raw vegan diet. It was called then an unfired diet, because he believed that you couldn't have the clarity of thought to be able to comprehend what he was teaching unless you ate this very pure diet. Now, here is a gentleman from antiquity that I learned about very recently, a Syrian poet and philosopher. I will let you pronounce this however you might pronounce it. But he was blind. He was blinded by smallpox early in his life, and he was really resentful about that. And so he was a cynic and an atheist, until later in his life he had some sort of spiritual awakening, which caused him to see that even in the great sufferings of life, we can find meaning through love and compassion. And he was possibly the world's first vegan who actually talked about why he didn't eat any animal products. Now, St. Francis, we don't know for sure that he was fully vegetarian because he ate just what people gave him. And sort of like the Buddhist monks that took whatever people gave them, he may have had animal food. Although at the time in history when he lived, most people were very poor. Animal foods were for the rich. So he was probably vegetarian. We do know that he talked about animals and he talked about nature, and he brought this into the dialogue of the Catholic Church. There's a beautiful film. It's a 1969 Franco Zeffirelli film called Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. Beautiful scene, probably not historical, when Francis goes to meet the Pope to be told if his being a band of religious brothers is really something sanctioned by the Holy Father. And he's very scruffy. They're all scruffy, and all of the people at the Vatican would like them to leave. But Pope Innocent supposedly said to him, "We have gotten so imbued in original sin that we have forgotten original innocence," which this man so displays. In this picture, there's a story that a wolf was eating the chickens and the other little animals that people had in the village, and they went to Francis because they wanted to kill the wolf, and they knew he would not approve. So supposedly he was an animal communicator, some of those, and he talked to the wolf, and the wolf said, "Well, I wouldn't kill their animals if they would just give me something to eat." So Francis relayed that message. They fed the wolf, and everybody lived in harmony after that. Now we're going to move from the west to the east, where through the Vedic traditions, we have these beautiful ahimsa religions. Now, I do need to say that in very ancient, what we call now India, in the times of the Vedas, there was animal sacrifice. Around the same time that they were having animal sacrifice in the temple in Jerusalem, which many people believe that the reason that Jesus overturned the money changers' tables was not that he was concerned about the money changing, but that he was concerned about the animal sacrifice. So we know that at that time in history, those things were done. Evolution was happening, moral evolution. And in India, in antiquity, we get three beautiful religions which have as their first tenet ahimsa: harmlessness, reverence for life, non-killing, non-violence. So we have here in the Yajurveda, one of the early Vedas, that you must not use your God-given body for killing God's creatures. So this is in the Hindu tradition. Not all Hindus are vegetarian. All avoid the meat from cows. All avoid beef. Many are vegetarian. In Jainism, almost everybody is vegetarian. I read a survey that 92% of Jains identify as complete vegetarians, not vegan, but vegetarians, no eggs. Jains also don't eat root vegetables because of the little bugs and things that are part of the harvesting of those. They don't eat mushrooms because that's on the line between animal and vegetable. And this quotation from one of the preeminent Jain saints is my favorite quotation in all the world. Because when people say, why are you a vegan? Why are you involved in animal rights? Why aren't you doing this, that, or something else? The answer is, to every creature, his life, her life, their life is very dear. And that changes everything for me. In Buddhism, we know that the Buddha wrote extensively about avoiding meat. He told the monks that they shouldn't use dairy, that they shouldn't wear leather shoes. Now there's an interesting split in Buddhism. The vegetarian message came into the Mahayana tradition that went north, and in the Theravada tradition that went south. It was kind of lost. In the Pali Canon is where Buddha says that monks can have anything that is given to them, that meat is all right to eat as long as it wasn't killed for you. So a lot of people today, a lot of Western Buddhists and others will say, well, the meat wasn't killed for me. But it was, because if you buy it at the grocery store, it was killed for the person who's going to pay for it. But the Buddhism that went north does have a beautiful vegetarian tradition. The first faux meats came not from Seventh-day Adventists in the 1950s, but from Buddhist monks in Japan over 1,000 years ago. And sometimes people will say, well, if you're a vegan, then why do you want something that looks or tastes like meat? You know, we get these tastes as little bitty tiny children. And these Buddhist monks were used to those tastes, and so they came up with the faux meats. Now, as we're coming quickly into Europe and coming more into the Renaissance period, the gentleman on our left is named Francis Quarles. He was a poet and an ethical vegetarian. The fellow in the middle, Luigi Cornaro of Venice, wrote a book called On the Sober Life, and he is possibly the first modern secular vegetarian and believed that vegetarianism and sobriety were very much connected, as some of the other people that we'll learn about in a minute or two also believed. And then we have Francis Bacon, who was an inconsistent vegetarian motivated by health. And lots of times people will say, oh, those health vegans, you know, they'll give it up in a minute. I don't know that that's necessarily true. Leonardo's probably the most famous vegetarian of this period, and he would go into the market in Florence and open the cages and let the birds fly free. So there was more vegetarianism happening in early America than we have thought about until recently. I learned about this person not long ago in the 1600s in Maine. There's actually a very interesting woman who writes for the Portland, Maine daily paper and has a real interest in vegetarian history in Maine and in New England. So this man was a French Jesuit missionary, and we think, well, that's not a very nice person coming over here to change the native people's ways. But once he met them and got to know them, he learned their language, and he actually died in a skirmish with colonial people trying to take the Indians' land, and he was on the side of the native people. Benjamin Franklin, actually, who is shown here, the top middle picture, we don't think of that as Benjamin Franklin, but when he was young, that's what he looked like. And he was vegetarian for several years in his youth, gave it up, regretted that later. He actually brought tofu to America. Then I guess we lost it, because back in the 70s, we had to go to an Asian market and pull it out of a vat of water with very long tongs. So we have to the right of Mr. Franklin, the Shelleys, the poet Percy and his wife Mary, who wrote Frankenstein. They were in England, of course. And remember that the British went to India, I believe the year was 1645, first for trade before the colonization happened. But there was an exchange of ideas. So anybody who could read English was getting some of these ideas from India of religious traditions, reincarnation, and vegetarianism. Now the woman on the lower middle is very interesting, Ellen G. White. She was the co-founder of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And in those days, women were not founding a lot of churches. They weren't even speaking in a lot of churches. But she was very interesting because she had visions, and she believed that God was giving her information about diet as well as other things. And so if you read her book about diet, it's called Counsels on Diet and Food, it reads like a whole food plant-based textbook of the 21st century, but this came to her through revelation, really fascinating. And the Adventists, of course, are largely vegetarian today. More than half of Adventists are vegetarian, and about half of them are vegan. Then we have Leo Tolstoy. He was in Russia, but he read in this Indian philosophy, became a very staunch vegetarian. And then up above, we've got John Wesley, who founded Methodism. Coming into the United States a little bit later, Reverend Graham was a Presbyterian minister. He also believed that sobriety was connected with eating meat. He didn't believe in meat eating, and he didn't believe in refined flour. He was a lot like Kay Stepkin. He was such a fine orator that when he went to Boston to speak in 1830, the butchers and the bakers got together to be sure that he wouldn't have a venue, because they believed that if people heard him, that their businesses would be very much damaged. Then coming into the 20th century, General William Booth founded the Salvation Army. He was vegetarian for health reasons and didn't talk about it much, unfortunately. Swami Paramahansa Yogananda came 28 years, I believe, after the first Indian Swami came to this country. The first Indian Swami, Vivekananda, was not vegetarian. Yogananda was. Then we have Isadora Duncan, a modern dancer, theosophist, vegetarian. Then Rosa Parks, which most people learn about Rosa Parks, didn't know she was vegetarian. And then the couple with the dog, that is Chief Air Marshal Lord Dowding and his wife Muriel, the Lady Dowding. He masterminded the Battle of Britain. He's buried with a stained glass window in Westminster Abbey, and they were very involved in all kinds of animal issues. They came into spiritualism when people were asking about what happened to my son, what happened to my husband, missing in the war, killed in the war, why was he killed? And so they were involving, as we were talking about yesterday, spiritualism and animal rights. They attended the coronation of Queen Elizabeth in faux ermine robes. Everybody at their level of peerage was supposed to wear ermine, and they managed to find it faux in the early 1950s. John Harvey Kellogg was a Seventh-day Adventist who was actually excommunicated late in his life because the church said he was becoming too pantheistic. But he was a GI surgeon, had quite a following. People would come from around the world until he finally woke up and thought, if people were eating the way I eat, I wouldn't have to operate on them. So he started the Battle Creek Sanitarium, and there is a movie about him. It's not a great movie, but it's called The Road to Wellville, and it's worth a watch. The most famous vegetarian probably of the 20th century, Mahatma Gandhi, had influence on all of these other people. And one thing I always like to point out to my students is this person influenced this person, influenced this person who's influencing us. And we're going to influence others, and that's how we will change the world. So Gandhi was a very staunch vegetarian. He learned about veganism in the 1940s as that was established in the UK. And he said that having to drink the milk of a goat, and he always had his own goat with him to be sure that the goat was well treated, he and he had bad stomach issues and could pretty much only eat goat's milk. We didn't have the things that we have now. But he called that the tragedy of his life. Now you think about what he devoted his life to, and as soon as India was independent, Pakistan split, wouldn't that be the tragedy of his life? But he called the tragedy of his life taking the milk from his goat. Jay and Freya Dinshaw started the American Vegan Society in 1960. Freya is still very much with us. This is the farm in Summertown, Tennessee. Some people say, oh, hippies were vegetarian. No, hippies didn't want to work, and so they ate brown rice and granola because it was cheap. But these hippies were definitely vegetarian. They're still there. And if you have some vegan cookbooks in your kitchen, chances are some of them come from the book publishing company, which is still there at the farm. So we've always had our celebrities. Gloria Swanson, Dr. Albert Schweitzer, Coretta Scott King became vegetarian late in her life, and her son Dexter King is vegan, and Olympian Carl Lewis. And nowadays, we've got our celebrities still. Sometimes it's problematic, because sometimes they're vegan for a while and then they decide not to be, and all of their followers that converted unconvert. But these people are all very committed. In 2021, the products of 2 companies spared 1 million cows. So that's beyond and impossible. And a lot of people say, I don't eat processed food, I don't eat that stuff. Well, don't eat it. But they did save all of these precious lives, and that's a lot. So the Compassion Consortium has a booth, 525, I think, if you want to stop in. We have Spirituality for Animal Advocates, Sunday service once a month. We have Animal Chaplaincy Training Program. And I would be honored if you stay connected with me. And if you, like I said, drop me a note, victoria@mainstreetvegan.com. I can invite you to those classes where we go into more depth about all of this. So I'm going to turn this over to Lisa Levinson, because we're just racing the clock. Lisa is the campaigns director for In Defense of Animals. She is the founder of Vegan Spirituality and a co-founder of the Interfaith Vegan Coalition, which is trying to bring these ideas to people in churches, synagogues, mosques, ashrams, wherever we find them. And she's a light in this world. Lisa.